let us then turn to Daniel chapter 3, the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There was a great king in Jerusalem at the time. His name was Nebuchadnezzar, and he was the king throughout all the land. And he built an idol in the center of his kingdom, a huge idol made of gold, wondrously decorated. And he summoned together all of the priests and all of the governors, all of his captains and judges and treasurers and counselors and earls, and everybody who you could possibly imagine was a part of his government and his kingdom. And he brought them all to this idol. And then a herald spoke out and said, when you hear the sound of the cornet and the flute and the trumpet and the drums and the sackbut, which I believe is the modern version of that would be the trombone, and the cymbal, and all of this great cacophony of sound, you are to bow down and worship before this idol. And the king made a proclamation throughout all the land that at certain times, whenever that alarm would sound with all of those instruments, then everyone was to bow down, stop what they were doing, bow down, and worship that particular idol, and turn and face in its direction. Well, that proclamation went throughout all the land, and everybody, when they heard that, would bow down and worship towards the idol, except for three. And those three people were three Jews by the name of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, these Jews were not just any old regular citizen of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom or subject of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. They were governors. They were three of his governors, and they were three of his best governors in three important provinces. And when they heard the alarm, they refused to bow down and worship it. Several other governors and other people that saw this became upset and went to Nebuchadnezzar and said unto Nebuchadnezzar, did you not make it a commandment that whenever anybody heard the sound of this drum and these flutes and all of this noise, that they had to bow down and worship, and if they did not, then those people would be destroyed? And the king Nebuchadnezzar said, why, yes, of course that's what I said, and that's still the law today. And then this person turned to him and said, well, what about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, your three governors, who do not bow down and worship before this altar all the time whenever you issue the command? And when Nebuchadnezzar learned of this, he was furious, and he sent forth, and he had Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego brought before him, and he asked them why. And they said that they refused. It was not their God. And he, being Nebuchadnezzar, was kind of in a bind. Here he had three of his best governors, very upstanding, excellent people, worked for him and did a great job governing, helping him to govern his kingdom. And on the other hand, he had these three same people who were disobeying his commands. So he was in a bind. He could keep his, three of his best governors and then have his commands which he had been given overturned, which means that he would lose authority in the eyes of his people, or he could destroy three of his best governors. Well, Nebuchadnezzar couldn't lose the authority in the eyes of his people, so he decided to go ahead and have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego bound. And he called upon his strongest servants, and he had them bound, and then he had them taken to a furnace. Now, this furnace was normally used to consume any baby, but Nebuchadnezzar was so angry that he had the furnace temperature turned up, and I believe it was turned up, a full seventh higher, as the Old Testament in book Daniel describes it. So it was much, much hotter than it normally would be. And as a result of this, those who had bound up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and were carrying them forth to throw them into the furnace were consumed by the flames and the heat of the furnace because it had been turned up so high, and they were themselves destroyed as they were in the process of throwing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the furnace. Now, as many of you know, at the end of this story, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not consumed in the flames of the furnace, and a fourth character joined them. The fourth character being described as the Spirit of the Lord walking among them, and they were not consumed. And so Nebuchadnezzar, upon seeing this, pulled them forth and called them out and said, apparently I was wrong, and there is no God greater than that God of Israel, and that no one throughout all the land can say anything bad about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God, because no other God could deliver them from the flames like their God hath, and therefore the God of Israel is a legitimate God. Well, that's the story then.